you for joining us for tonight's online lecture titled Single Moms and Virtual Dads, hosted by Dr. Patricia Prieto-Blanco. Thank you. Good evening also to you, Patricia. You are based in Ireland right now, where it's a bit earlier.
Yeah, it's about an hour earlier. Thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. So just for the audience, before we start, I will give the word to my colleague Nadine Isabel, who will say some organizational things for the audience. So yeah, please go ahead, Nadine.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Nadine. I'm the curatorial fellow at Fotomuseum at the moment. I'm today in charge of the technical part. So just a quick note, we will record this talk. So everyone is right now muted during the presentation part of Patricia. And then afterwards, everyone can basically continuously put in their questions into the chat function. And later on, we will include them all in the talk. So just that you know, the chat function is the way to participate. And on the other hand, as this talk is recorded, we ask you kindly, if you don't want to be seen in the video, please switch off your camera. So that's already all from the technical side. And I hope everything will work perfectly. So enjoy, and I give back to Katrin.
Thank you, Nadine. Welcome, Patricia. It's a pleasure to welcome you tonight, and we feel very honored that you make the time to speak to us about artistic methods of the 20th and 21st century that have reflected changes in contemporary families in the past 60 years. And for everybody who doesn't know your name and background yet, it's important to mention that you work as a media scholar. And as well as a lecturer in digital media practice in the Department of Sociology at the Lancaster University in the UK. And Patricia's interdisciplinary expertise is focused on visual research methods, image-based activism, and media practices in the context of migration and kinship. And ethnographically, you have also worked with transnational families and explored how they incorporate photography in everyday routines, addressing media practices as well. And just also a short side note, tonight's online lecture is part of our event program for our current exhibition, Chosen Family, Less Alone Together. And it's also worth mentioning that you were one of our contributing authors for the same titled catalog, in your essay in which you examined circulating digital photographs as tools for dialogues between families. Mm-hmm. And tonight we have the pleasure to hear you pointing out how the normalized idea of family began to be challenged through art photography. And so, Patricia, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us. And you can go ahead and share your slides if you want to. Yeah. And later on, we can do, of course, a Q&A with the audience. Please feel free to add your questions in the chat, and then we can later on integrate them in our discussion. So thank you, Patricia.
All right, thank you, Nadine, and thank you, Katrin, very much for that wonderful introduction. I'm really honored to be here tonight to share a few thoughts about how art photography in the past 60 years has been challenging normalized ideas of families. As Katrin was explaining before, I wrote a little chapter on practices of transnational families for the catalog of the current exhibition at the museum. And while I was working ethnographically with these families, I was also looking at how professional photographers, art photography in particular, had gone about the concept of family. So it was kind of like a side project that I was developing alongside the other investigation. So much of what I published in the catalog has been informed by what I'm going to talk about tonight. So the title of the lecture is called Single Moms and Virtual Dads, and it's supposed to be a nod to both the contemporary notions of family, and how the traditional nuclear family has been dissolved in the last 30 years foremost with postmodernity and late capitalism, and also to a nod to the digitization of photography. And this lecture tries to explore both of those notions. So generally, when we talk about family photographs, we talk about a genre of photography that has served to normalize normative visions of the family unit, reflecting popular media representations of family as certain, given, and definitive. Both photographs and family, or photography and family, were constructed on the basis of the paradigm of evidence, trace, and memory, both belonging to the project of systematically categorizing the world with certainty and for posterity. In the context of what we call snapshot photography, or like everyday photography, families have traditionally been shown as the one in this picture. So happy, heteronormative, white, as fundamental units for the correct functioning of society. Much of contemporary photography still celebrates this hegemonic notion of family, but luckily, art photography has been showing us the diversity of family and kin for the past 60 years at least. In fact, there is a term that describes this. It's the term intimate art photography, which was coined by Charlotte Cotton in her 2009 book, The Photograph as Contemporary Art. With intimate art photography, Cotton describes a genre in fine art photography that, and I quote, borrows and redirects the language of domestic photography and family snaps for public display. And by using seemingly unskilled photography as an intentional device, it signals the intimacy of the relationship between the photographer and her or his subjects. So the kind of art photography that we will be looking at today could all be grouped within this genre of intimate art photography. So like family albums, the ones that you have in your own house, the ones that you have seen millions of times, intimate art photography uses a snapshot style, but is often blended with a high art aesthetic. So while those photographs look like you could have taken them yourself, they are very much formal and intentional. Intimate art photography features also the search of self-identity, the feminist reappropriation and control over the body. It deals with the repressed and the taboo, as well with illness, aging, and death as recurring themes. Furthermore, it usually features the same people, family members, but also friends and lovers. And unlike the family album, and this is important, intimate art photography is about showing what the album usually tries to hide. This is how family photography is normative, and this is how intimate art photography is most subversive, by revealing what usually is hidden away. So the fine art photography we will be looking at today may remind you of your own family snapshots, but it's worth keeping in mind that these are photographs made for public exhibition, and as such, they are tools of contestation against the oppressive notion of nuclear family. So this has established some of the bases of the kind of art photography that we'll be looking at tonight, but I would also like to establish another little line another little ground line, I suppose. For me, it is very important to have at least some understanding of the social, cultural, and individual context of where a piece of art is situated before attempting to understand its meaning and relevance. So before I present the work of different photographers going from the 1960s to more or less today, I will give some few notes about the historical and cultural period in which it was produced. This is particularly important, I believe, because the interpretation of photographs can change over time, and the context of photographs in which photographs are inserted also changes its meanings very, very quickly. Photography is a very fluid medium. If you think of memes, for example, that will give you an example on how photography is a fluid medium. The words attached to a meme change its meaning significantly, and photographs that compose them would be interpreted very different in isolation. So let's start with the beginning. Let's start by the nuclear family. This is the notion that the art photography I will be talking about tonight tries to contest time and time again. So when we refer to family photographs in general, we mean albums or portraits, snapshots that show an ideal family unit, right? And this ideal family unit, it's primarily nuclear. This means quote unquote 2.4 kids, white, patriarchal, heterosexual, middle class, capitalist, and happy. Right? It was actually advertising, and particularly Kodak advertising, that established and perpetuated this norm and taught photographers, and I mean everyday photographers, not professional ones, what family photographs should look like. This was the norm established as well by society after the social and cultural upheaval of Second World War, where a return to traditional and conservative values was the norm, was the ideology of the time. And this put women back into the household and men back into the workforce. So families were supposed to go back to the traditional gender norms and the traditional as well family values of rearing children in a particular middle-class hegemonic way. It is important, especially, I suppose, because of the political climate in Europe at the moment, to note that this norm still exists and unfortunately seems to be thriving in some parts of Europe at the minute. One way in which we can see how this traditional notion of family was established is by looking at advertising at the time. So I have brought you a couple of examples apart from that one. So here you can also see how Kodak is directing families to consume their products in a particular way. So it's telling their consumers to photograph certain situations. So in all three advertisements, you can see that it's about leisure time. So these are families that have discretionary income, so money that they can spend in activities other than, you know, food and work. So they are middle-class families, they can travel, they can go for a day out, they may own a swimming pool. And as you can see, they are all fundamentally white, and the gender roles are very, very clear, right? And it is important to note that when I'm talking about all of this, I'm referring particularly to the Western world, specifically the USA, Canada, Australia, and Western Europe. Some countries in Europe at the time didn't really follow this norm. For example, Ireland, Portugal, and Spain didn't subscribe to that norm for a longer period of time. Perhaps the strong links in these countries between the state and Catholic religion were the cause for larger families than the nuclear one to be the norm. For example, in Spain, which is the country I'm from, there was a yearly prize for the most numerous family. Okay, so Franco, the dictator, and the dictatorship in Spain went up until 1978 with the constitution. Franco died in 1975. So we are talking a ton of years in here. So every year, the dictator Franco would give a prize to the most numerous family in the country, counting only parents and children. So it was often the case that for grandparents to live in the same house. So the household would be composed of more than one generation, but this was not counted for the prize. Right, so honors were actually given in three different categories. One for the most babies born into a single family, another one for the family with the most surviving children, which is a testament to the high infant mortality rates at the time, and one for the couple with the largest number of descendants still living at home. A prize that seems that after the 2008 crisis could be revived given the context of young people in Spain not being able to move away. So this was the context in Spain. By no means this is a nuclear family, but it's still very heteronormative. If we look at the US and probably Northern Europe and the UK, the context looks very different. The ideal family, it is the 2.4 children one. It is white, it is middle class, it is affluent, and it was exemplified by John Fitzgerald Kennedy and his wife, Jackie. So this is like the norm that is circulating in mass media, in television, in newspapers, you name it. But there were other families and there were other people, art photographers, trying to capture the diversity of family life at the time. But so it all started, if we have to give a point in which if we have to mark a point as a beginning, it would be maybe the 60s. So in the late 1960s, these norms begin to be challenged as part of the wider cultural revolution that included the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and particularly second wave feminism. So the whole notion of nuclear family was called into question. Particularly, there is a book or a piece of work that challenged this idea of the happy nuclear family, which is the feminine mystique by Betty Friedan. So this investigation revealed how profoundly unhappy American white housewives were. So it really set the basis for calling into questions all those norms about how women had to live, about the gender notions of family. And it was, if you like, the beginning of what we call the second wave feminism. At the time, photojournalism was trying to challenge these notions, but art photography, it was still a very young medium in the art world. Photography was not really established as an art form in the 1960s. So there weren't many fine art photographers doing this work, the work of subversion, if you like. But there is one that that really did so. So I'm talking here about Diane Arbus. So Diane Arbus has been by many called as the photographer of the bizarre, if you like, always trying to capture people in the fringes of society, people who look odd, or people who would live outside of the norms. And she started an unfinished series that is called The Family Album, in which she photographed both the odd looking, if you like, of the awkward in society, and the normal ones, quote unquote. So I have put these two photographs side by side for you to have an idea or get a glimpse of the kind of subversion that her work represents. So on the one hand, she's representing families that don't look like the traditional family we are used to see in the Kodak adverts or in television and news media, which would be the photograph on the left. But on the photograph on the right, she is photographing such a nuclear, white, middle-class family. However, she's photographing a moment that is definitively not happy. Right, so the man there doesn't look particularly happy. There is a total disconnection between the three subjects in the photograph. And even though there is a pool, there is a garden, there are all sorts of commodities being shown on that photograph, it doesn't particularly look like they're having a good time. I think that's where Diane Arbus' work is the strongest, when she takes a look for us into the happy world and shows the cracks, so how that happiness is actually being superficial. It's a superficial look at what a family is. So these are two further photos from Diane Arbus. So here she's showing a kid, and look at what he has on her hand, but also the pose. This would not be the kind of photograph that you would want to have in your normal family album of your kid. You would want the kid to pose, to look happy, to look quote unquote normal. And in the photograph on the right, even though there are no people, I think it's very significant how the family Christmas tree looks completely pushed against the corner, right? So it's almost as transmitting to me, this photograph really transmits that oppression of heteronormativity in family life, right? So Diane Arbus was producing this work in the 1960s, but it really didn't, this work really didn't didn't really get the recognition it deserved until decades later. So really, we can think that it was more or less like a decade. It took a decade for work that was challenging, also ideas of traditional family to appear again in the scene of art photography. So it was in the late 1970s and 80s that we start to see more art photographers challenging the heteronormativity of families, with Tulsa from Larry Clark, the work of Nan Goldin, and in Spain, Pablo Pérez Mínguez, who was the photographer of La Movida in the 80s. And what is significant here is that unlike in the work of Diane Arbus, families here start being composed not by members of kin by blood, but by kinship that is not blood kinship, it's another type of kinship. It's kinship that is made by affection, by bonds that are not necessarily linked to blood at all. Okay, so I would like to start with Larry Clark and his work, Tulsa. So this follows really his friends, or in following the title of the exhibition at the museum right now, this follows his family of choice, who were his friends around the town of Tulsa in Oklahoma. So on the one hand, the work reflects the youth culture of the time and the big problem that there was with drugs at the time, but it also reflects how those friendship bonds become really strong and become substitution for the blood kinship that we know from previous works. So perhaps I should have made a disclaimer before showing these photographs, because they are not the easiest to look at. So I'm doing it now. If you are very sensitive, just maybe look away for the next few seconds. So this is another one, which I find particularly striking. So you can see the intimate connection here that Charlotte Cotton was talking about. There is an intimate connection between the photographer and the subject. These people look at the person behind the lens with a different set of eyes than if they were in a studio. There is a real connection, a real affect between the subject who is being photographed and the photographer. And in the work of Nan Goldin, you can see that intimate connection as well. And you can see that the constellation of friends and lovers have become Nan Goldin's family of choice too. So both works challenge that idea of heteronormativity. Particularly Nan Goldin started to photograph quite a bit of queer culture in New York City, but in general, the youth culture in New York City was the scene in which she placed her work, and she developed those kinships, if you like, those affective kinships. And these are probably some of the first portraits of gay love that we've seen within art photography. I think they are very strong. They are a testament as well of the AIDS epidemic that was rampant in the 80s. And then we have Pablo Pérez Mínguez, who I have situated with them, okay, even though in terms of time, if we just look at the timeline, it would come a little later. And this is because the kind of cultural revolution that was experienced in other parts of the world in the late 60s, 70s, didn't arrive to Spain until Franco, the dictator, died, right? So we are talking about the 80s. So Pablo Pérez Mínguez was also, like Nan Goldin and Larry Clark, documented the youth culture at his time, his contemporaries, his colleagues, his friends, queer culture in particular. And his photographs are very similar in terms of themes to the ones of Nan Goldin. So the nightclubs have a particular presence as those places where youth can start to develop those affective relationships that become really networks of support for all of them. And well, I always say this because it's kind of maybe funny, or I guess a curiosity. This person on your left with in the pink suit, that's Pedro Almodóvar, who you may know as a famous film director, and it's also the person on the right photograph with the leg raised up. And another thing that Pablo Pérez Mínguez did very well, which is kind of exemplarized in this photograph, is to be very sarcastic with Catholic motifs that had dominated the Spanish society until the death of Franco. So this is a very famous humorist in Spain who is posing as Jesus Christ, but it just has a fan on the back. So this kind of photography is challenging both the traditional notions of family, but also the ideology or the religious ideology that sustain that traditional notion of family in a very religious country like Spain was or is. Okay. So that was happening in Spain in the 80s. We were all free, queer culture, a lot of things to do, everyone being able to be whoever they wanted to be. In other parts of the world, especially in the US and the UK, the 80s actually saw a return to conservatism. So some people call this backlash feminism, and it was precipitated by the election of both Reagan and Thatcher at the same time. And they brought about the very conservative stances, which prompted a return to conservatism in popular culture, in the media, in mainstream culture in general, and also in the art scene. However, there were still photographers willing to challenge those conservative notions, and I have chosen to highlight two in particular. Joe Spence in the United Kingdom and Sally Mann in the US. So Spence is a work that we can qualify as largely working class and underground, and it was profoundly feminist, not only because of the themes that her work features, but also because of the way in which Joe Spence used to work. She really took the slogan, the personal is political, to large extents and made it work for the politics of representation of her work, but also the way in which she produced photography. So she was a great friend of working with others democratically, in a very collaboratively, very transparent, very open way. And her work was very influential in the women movement in the UK, at the very least, for two reasons. First, she was all about women regaining control over their identity and subjectivity from the oppressive patriarchal culture. And second, it visualized much of the radicalism of postmodernism and situated art photography as a practice of dissent and change, a practice of revolution, if you like. So Spence, in that way, combined two key elements of postmodernism, feminism and photography, and she did so in an accessible way. So whether you are or you were trained art historian or just a working class mother, you see her photographs and you can get something out of them. And that was also profoundly revolutionary in the art world. So her work is profoundly theoretical and subversive while approachable. She pioneered three ways of doing so. She looked back at family albums and she understood how they were tools of patriarchal control. And she wrote about all of this and put her reflections to the service of the public by writing about it in a book that was called Putting Myself in the Picture, which is quite a liberating book, as it makes you as a reader realize how much of family photography is constructed and how much is left out of family albums and purpose, on ideological purposes of reproducing hegemonic ideas of what families should look like. Second, she developed with Rose Martin and several other collaborators the practice of phototherapy, and these two photographs are part of that work. So phototherapy involves dealing with your past in a cathartic way, while questioning photography's ability to capture reality, quote unquote. So if you like, it's a form of art therapy in which you recreate memories of your past via role playing. And this process allows you to bring psychological resolution to problems that you had in your past and that unconsciously still wear you down, if you like, still shape you as an adult. This was a revolutionary way of perceiving photography, of making photography, and it's still pretty much in use today. And the third way in which Spence's work was really controversial, revolutionary, and profoundly feminist is because he helped develop a style of political photography that was all about making a statement. So this is not so much about, as I said before, about how her photographs look like or what she shows on her photographs, although in the ones that I have selected here, it's very clear that she's making a statement about gender roles, but it's about how she loved really to work with others, and how that practice of collaboration and leaving the ego and the kind of authorship behind, or that logic of the authorship behind, really inspired many other women to pick up a camera and do similar work for themselves. So really empower women to enter a world that had been and still is profoundly masculine. Okay, her long-term collaborator Solomon sums this up very well when she says, and I quote, "Jo Spence demonstrates the process of gaining access to buried memories and suppressed feelings, revealing how the richness of women's stories can be mined. She shows how an unraveling of the past helps her to understand the present. No less important are the unearthing of the large political secrets which shape our lives, locating women's personal history in a wider political context." And end of quote. So this is the work of Jo Spence. These are more series of her family album interpretation. And this is Sally Mann. So as you can see, going from one to the other, their style is completely different, right? So Jo Spence speaks much more about the snapshot, kind of casual, everyday flash photography through a wake camera. And Sally Mann's photographs are beautifully constructed, very formal. The light is amazing, the treatment of light. So in terms of style, they are very far away, but in terms of their feminist stance, they are really close, I think. So Sally Mann actually uses her own family, and so she uses her camera to document the everyday life of her children in rural Virginia, right? So why do I think that they are feminist? Because these photographs show family from the perspective of the mother, which is something that had remained hidden or kept away at the very least from mainstream media and popular culture until this very time. So her images include children playing around naked in the garden, children getting hurt, like here. And that particular issue of children being naked was something very controversial of her work. So actually some critics deemed her work as being pornographic, okay? So her images break the taboo and include many things that were absent from the family album, making a statement about what family life is actually about. So going behind that superficial look that Kodak wanted us to have, and showing all the mundane and the taboo, the sadness, the disputes, the illness, everything that belongs to our everyday lives, whether we like it or not, whether we show it or not. Another point that I always bring about when I talk about Sally Mann's work and the issue with children being naked is that I believe that Sally Mann used or pointed out her camera to her children in a very anthropological way. And I will explain this. So before Sally Mann, we had seen, or photography had seen many images of naked children before. And it had never been a problem. For example, Mead, with Balinese character, there are a ton of photos of children naked running around, and that was a highly celebrated body of work. However, they weren't white children. They weren't white, middle-class American children being photographed in that way. They were the others. So I think that the problem starts when that anthropological or kind of gaze, if you like, is applied to the colonial empire, right? So I don't think that the critics had a problem with nakedness of children in general, but with the nakedness of white children in a capitalist society. So I think that more than anything, this work didn't sit well with white privilege because it disrupted profoundly. And I must say that the work of Sally Mann later on has examined her own white privilege in many other ways. And I really would encourage you to have a look at the last two bodies of work that she has produced. So, but moving forward, so that was the 80s. By the early 90s, things begin to shift again. So by this time, you probably have guessed that everything's kind of like a pendulum. So we go from more liberal to more conservative and back again. So in the early 90s, we hit another period of liberalism, if you like, or more progressive views, and also more money. So more money means that there is more money to be made in the art market. And this brings recognition to the photographers that I talked about before. So the work of Sally Mann, Nan Goldin, Spence start getting recognition and starts being valued at this time. And also a renewed critical questioning of the normative construction of family begins to emerge. And one key work in that respect is Racial Love by Richard Billingham in the UK. I particularly like this work because it shows working class families in the UK, the good and the bad, everything together. And in doing so, it breaks the stereotypical notion of what working class means. And it situates these people as people, not just as subjects, but as people, as human beings capable of doing mistakes, but also capable of loving each other and having really close, really beautiful relationships, but also being able to work through arguments like everybody else. And if we go a little further, we start finding photographers that take the baton from these photographers that I have been examining before and push those notions of alternative families or families of choice a little further. One of them is Ryan McGinley, okay, in which we can find that essence of friends of family, families of choice, youth culture that we saw in Larry Clark and also in Nan Goldin's work. But his work is much more aestheticized, is very beautiful from a formal point of view. It would remind you more of the work of Sally Mann. And this was all before Instagram, but when you look at his photographs, you can see almost like an Instagram look with them. The treatment of color is particularly good, and yeah, and you can see just the celebration of youth, if you like, of all those affective bonds, of family being what you choose and who you spend time with, and not something that is imposed on you, but unit that is continuously renegotiating that, and that is made out of experiences. So this is the work of Ryan McGinley. It's another one. And after that, I'm going to introduce you to a few other photographers a little quicker as well, because I think I'm running maybe a little bit out of time. Okay, so these are photographers in this section look closely at what intimate family looks like in reality. So in reality, quote unquote. So building up upon the work of Sally Mann and Richard Billingham. So we have a recent body of work by Johan Beeman, okay, who looks at fathers doing the work traditionally reserved for mothers. And in doing so, he is challenging traditional gender roles within the family and within the rearing of children particularly. And these photographs, again, are formally very beautiful. They are displaying or featuring moments that usually you would not see in the family album, in a similar way as the earlier work of Eleanor Carucci, Closer, does. The main difference is that Eleanor Carucci, in a similar way as Sally Mann and Richard Billingham, looked at her own family, but John and Beeman looked at other families. So he spent several months photographing fathers who had taken paternal leave to take care of their children and photographing their everyday lives. The work of Eleanor Carucci is also full of those moments that you would not really choose to display in your own family albums, like those two, for example, comparing boobs, or her parents just in bed with her mom doing some sort of beauty routine. There is also some blood, some injuries, children getting hurt. Is a work that displays quite a lot of intimacy and the connection between the photographer and the subject being photographed. But it's also, for me, it's a work that sometimes works a little contrived, as there is an element of posing too much. And then there is this other photographer that he hasn't done very much, but I particularly like this fanzine that he published in the early 2000s. Which is called Dog Days, and is, as you can see, really, this is the photo album of a dog. Okay, so how did he do that? So Ricardo Nava at the time was living in Berlin, and he was a fan of going into flea markets. So he found a photo album, you know, just for sale in there, like many family photo albums end up in such flea markets, and proceeded to take out all the photographs with people on them, and leaving then only photographs of the dog, right? And this, for me, really exemplifies how animals, pets, are also part of the family, and have never been, or in the other works of the other photographers I've presented today, do not take such a prominent role. But if you ever had a pet, you probably have considered your pet part of the family. So this is just like a little fanzine, and Ricardo Nava since then hasn't really built upon on the work. But I always like to bring this up just to think as well of family beyond human actors only. So I started to introduce the theme of the Anthropocene here. This is my own work. And this I did in response to everything that is hidden away from the family album. So originally these were 3D photographs in which the whole on the photograph is what really catches your eye, is what the 3D part of the photographs. And these are prints that I recovered from my grandma's family album, where she had decapitated a family member that she felt she no longer needed in those photographs. Now, at the time, I thought that that process of decapitation was brutal, but afterwards, studying family photography, I came to realize that other people also decapitate family photographs to get rid of the undesirable, kind of to clean the family album from all those bad influences, if you like. And in this series, I decided to include this here as well, to start thinking about my own work with transnational families and the idea of home. So I've started to put together these little collages, trying to explain or trying to visualize the notion of living across different places, living across different homes. So how does it look when the family extends through different geographical locations? But moving forward onto the issue of the family album as such, there are a few other photographers I would like to introduce to you today. The first one is Trish Morrissey. And we don't really have time to do the kind of a game that I usually do with my students when I talk to them about her work. But so essentially, I usually show them the photographs and I ask them what all these photographs have in common, and, you know, go back and forth. And when I get to this photograph, then people realize that there is one person that appears in all photographs, and that's the artist, Trish Morrissey. Okay, so this is the work front, in which she plays with that idea of the family portrait. So she inserts herself in constellations of people, kind of proving that really all those notions of what a family should look like are really constructed, and that anybody with a little bit of I suppose interpersonal skills and a bit of a performance character can imitate. So what she did this in Australia foremost, and she would get the clothes of the person that she was about to impersonate and then insert herself in the photographs. In doing so, she demonstrates the fallacy of the reality of photography, of capturing reality of photography, and she carried this into her work after this, which was 7 years after, which it was kind of like a phototherapy project. But unfortunately, we don't have time to look at everything. So I wanted to look at Breda Vivan as well. Sadly, Breda Vivan passed away 10 years ago due to cancer, and there aren't many photographs left. So she left too early. It's really too bad, because her work is really, really strong, brings about a theme that is, I'd say, almost absent from family photography today and in the last 60 years. It was more common for this theme to appear in family photography in Victorian times, but not in our current society. And this theme is death. Okay, so what you are seeing here are the ashes of her partner. So her partner died, and she started to do this work where she photographed her partner ashes in their everyday context. And again, this is something that you would normally not see in the family albums, and this work is profoundly controversial and subversive, because she's addressing that taboo and putting it there on the foreground. There is another set of photographers that challenge both the notion of traditional family alongside with the notion of the photographic evidence. These are photographers that have been working more towards the early 2000s, so we're talking now about the 21st century, really. And I have included here Domingo Martinez, John Clan, Chino Tsuka, and Alexander Lang. So I will start talking by Chino Tsuka. She inserts herself along her former self as a kid in photographs. She does it in a way that it's very difficult to see whether the photographs have been retouched or not. And in doing so, she challenges that way of photographs being for memory and for posterity. So in a way, I see quite a bit of a connection between China Otsuka and the phototherapy process that Joe Spence was working with. Domingo Martinez interrogates that state of the digital in a more, I suppose, playful way. So this is a work that is called Holidays or Vacaciones, and it interrogates that capacity of photography to hold memory for us in the digital age. And these are not photographs, these are paintings actually. So he resorts to painting, he's a multimedia artist, and he resorts to painting to call upon that dubitative character of the digital and how that will impact on the memories that we keep, on the familial memories that we keep. Alexander Lang uses digital photography to highlight the difficult aspects of reading children. So he uses digital retouching to make clear that bringing up a family, reading children is not all fun and good times, but there are also difficult aspects, and digital technology serves him to do that, to exaggerate those moments of conflict that are also usually hidden from family albums. And I like to finish today by talking about one of my favorite artists in relation to family photography, is John Klang. I absolutely love his work from beginning to end. I came across his work about 12 years ago when he was doing what later was known about as the Skype portraits, where he combined online video conferencing, image projection, and digital photography. In that way, he acknowledged both the potentialities of digital technology to recreate a third space, a space that it was in between time zones and geographical locations, our family members that were distant could come together. The photographs are clearly staged, and they are built on known conventions of family portraits, or on the pragmatics of family photography, one could say. He investigates how we inhabit our virtual spaces with the aid of technologies. This is his own family, but then he expanded the work and photographed families across the world. And he called the series Being Together. I believe that Being Together illustrates the contemporary role of digital photographic practices as a means of communication rather than as a means of representation. One of the things that I really loved about his work is that he, like Joe Spence, he's a photographer that understands the production of photograph as an intrinsic part of his work, and he's not shy to talk about it. So I talked to him years and years ago when I was doing my PhD, and he was telling me that these portraits, and I quote, "These portraits are not about being together with technology. The main core of the session is to bring the dynamic emotion in one family portrait across continents, aided with the current technology for future reflection. The process of how it's taken will make each family member remember, and the delicate relationship between each member during and up to that moment will be known internally to each of them. It goes beyond grouping them together to take a picture." So he was explaining how, instead of resorting to very professional ways of putting the family members together, he would actually ask family members to help with the production of the picture, so that all of them could remember the moment, and that could be something very special for them. I know I'm late. Okay, so afterwards, he's continued to explore kind of these family portraits in this series that is called The Moment. And the last thing that he has done is about the guilt of being a migrant, and it's something that really speaks to my heart, being a migrant myself. And so his family was always asking him, when are you coming back home? And he was always responding, it's not possible for me. So I think that the erasure here of people's faces, of his father and his mother's faces, speaks as well to that interrogation of the familial bonds and how that has to be renewed over time, and how some may die if we don't take care of them. So that's it from me. I'm very happy to talk about anything else, and I'm sorry I went a little over time.
No, thank you so much, Patricia. It was a pleasure listening to all of your to all of the artistic methods that you just introduced to us. It's as we know, a broad field in terms of family photography. Thank you so much for your online lecture. And I would now really give the audience, and also for the two of us, to give the chance to exchange questions for the time left. So please feel free to pose any questions in the chat, and we can implement them in our conversation just now. You can also ask to unmute yourself and directly ask questions. But before that, I would just like to refer to the quote that you mentioned for Joe Spence that I really loved. The personal is political. Oh, yeah. And it, of course, affects so many artists that you introduced just now, and how they work with that too. So we can also always think about how photography is a public medium to some extent, but it's also mostly used in a private space. And I would like to know from you, because you work as a media scholar and visual sociologist, how did you go into visual sociology, and what kind of role do photographs and images in general play for your research practice?
Okay, so I went into visual sociology because I figured out that there are ways of telling stories that need pictures, but also because, how can I say this in a very polite way? Because I want to make research also accessible, okay? And I feel that sometimes the way we write academic tests, it really is not very accessible, okay? So I feel that when we employ images in our research, we are really trying to make it count outside of what we call the ivory tower. So that was one of the main reasons. But then also because I think that there are certain social processes that are often excluded from public view. And I felt that by capturing those with my camera, I could make a bigger statement than just talking about them.
I see. And do you, maybe can you say something about the quote that I stumbled upon when I look on your website? It's from Howard Becker, a US American sociologist.
Yes.
I can just quickly mention it, quote, "For any picture, ask yourself what question or questions it might be answering. Since the picture could answer many questions, we can decide what question we are interested in." So maybe following up on your presentation, it's also, of course, important to reflect what kind of questions you entered when looking at the pictures, because some people pose different questions to images. Like you did it with Saliman, you pose a totally different questions to her images than others would usually do. So is there a specific strategy in sociology that in how you enter an approach an image, a photograph?
Yeah, from that same sociologist, he has a text that is called "It's all a matter of photojournalism, art photography, or visual sociology. It's all a matter of context." That's the title of the article. And I think that's how visual sociologists enter the field, right? So you decide that the questions that you are going to ask are about social processes. So often the work of a visual sociologist is not about representation, which is something that is kind of difficult to understand, I think, from an outsider perspective. So we are not so worried about interpreting what's in the picture or what's not in the picture. as much as we are worried about how the picture was produced, why was it produced, how is it being circulated, where is it going to be stored. So what kind of social practices is that picture supporting, you know? So is it a picture produced to end up in an exhibition? Is something that has been produced to keep a memory for the future, you know? So pictures as tools for something else, similar into my research, like where the chapter I wrote for the exhibition catalog, right? I was arguing there that pictures in that case, in the case of transnational families, weren't really supporting the memory making as much as they were becoming tools of communication, tools of tools for families to talk across time and space.
And you also oppose kind of fine art photography with everyday family photography. And then I don't know if that's correct what I'm saying, but because you introduced us to so many practices where artists challenge the notion of the nuclear family and call it into question, do you think that everyday family photographer differs really that much from fine art photography, where it's mostly staged and the light is very set and everything is thought through? And so I'm interested in how you tackle, of course, fine art photography that ends up in an exhibition, and how do you put it on, how do you balance it when you work as a visual sociologist with everyday vernacular photography that is not supposed to be public?
Yeah, well, I think that's the main difference, whether the intention is to make those photographs public or not, whether the intention is to make money out of those photographs or not, money or recognition or prestige or reputation. So that would be a main difference for me, to categorize something as one or the other. Now, with Instagram, for example, and social media, all those borders are completely blurred at the minute. Because a lot of our personal vernacular photography is being showcased to everybody, right? And also because we are using our vernacular photography is much more fuller of with filters and aesthetic concerns nowadays than it used to be, right? So I think that the way in which snaps of photography has evolved is that people are much more literate, if you like, on how they take pictures, right? So they are applying all of that to their picture production, which in turn is becoming more formal, if you like, more aesthetic, more pleasing to the eye, So in terms of, that's why I always look beyond the representation. So I always look at how and why it is an image produced, how and why it's going to be distributed, where it's going to be stored, all of those processes beyond how does a photograph look like, what's on the picture. That's important as well. But in order to be able to attach a label to something, if you like, I think you need to look at all of it, not only at the representation.
Thank you. So sorry, I just muted myself. No, that's totally correct, to have this broad understanding when looking at a photograph and to integrate all of it. And so you did mention that you work with transnational families too. And do you feel like when doing your projects and working with those families, that photography kind of helped to maintain familiar constellations? Or can you elaborate maybe on that and what it
absolutely. Yes. Long story short, yes, it does help. It helps to build what in technical terms we call social capital. Okay. So it helps to keep relationships alive. It helps to socialize children into larger family units. It also helps to create bonds. And this is all because photography, but also video, Skype, things like that, WhatsApp. So I'm talking about photography that is shared all the time, Yeah, it's that kind of intermittent but constant process of exchange that helps maintaining the bond, creating those affections, you know, making the family unit be sustained as such over time. So it's not as just taking a beautiful family portrait and hanging it over your fireplace. That's not going to solve your problems, you know. But the constant being in touch and sharing part of the everyday, visualizing that every day and sharing it and exchanging, that does help. Yeah, all families coincided on that. Each family did it in their own way. Some people did it with WhatsApp, some people did PowerPoints, all sorts of things.
So maybe before I continue posing any questions, I would like to ask the audience to also share any questions in case you have some, because the time is already is already up. And yeah, I mean, in a time where, you know, the notion of family is always changing, and the idea of home, especially during Corona times, the idea of home and family has changed so much for many of us. It affects all of us, and maybe the audience wants to share any questions or comments. So please feel free to, yeah, let us know. If you want to share any personal experiences or stories in terms of your own experiences with family photography, but then otherwise, I would like to thank you. Patricia, thank you very much.
I don't know if it's possible to talk.
Oh, yes.
I think you have another question in the comments.
Oh, yeah,
so
thank you.
I want to say thank you to Patricia. We both work together. I'm in Barcelona, and we have just had the delightful visit of Patricia in my university. I'm really happy because you have a very different approach. And I was just wondering if you see any difference, because you were talking about single parents or the role parents in photographs. So I don't know if you see any differences between the artists in this kind of approach with the common users, traditional family approach. The evolution, if there is a big difference, or they are going like parallel with the treatment of the roles of parents and mothers. And thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, very good observation. So one thing, if you have noticed, most of the photographers that I have mentioned are women. Surprise, surprise. Women paying attention to family. So that already gives a hint. But then in the families I work with, there was a mix. Okay, so there were parents, both men and women, involved in the taking and sharing and so on of photographs. In terms of who does the parenting, there were differences for different family, you know. But in terms of the curating, the family album and so on, I would say I have encountered like a 50-50 situation, but yeah, women tended to be more involved in the story, involved in the telling of family stories, involved in the in the storytelling, in the putting those photographs to work. Maybe not so much on the taking or on the digital storing of those photographs, but into sharing those with other family members, their own children, kind of making those photographs work for the creation or maintenance of familial bonds. Surprise, surprise.
So we do have two more questions in the chat. Thank you, Rebecca, for sharing your thoughts. Jake Lange is asking, can I ask you how Instagram, or can I ask you how you think Instagram culture is affecting or affected by traditional Western notions of the family? So the role of social media, of course.
Yeah. Okay.
It's a big.
It's big, and I haven't been on Instagram in 2 years, so I'm probably missing a lot.
Yeah,
too much.
no,
It's
you're
too much
not.
for me. But in general, how do I think that social media is affecting this? I think, like we were talking about before, Catherine, I think that a lot of the intimate moments are becoming public, but I also think that they are very curated, you know. So I tend to see the stuff that I see in social media that quote unquote everyday people publish. I think those are moments that are to a certain extent posed, highly aesthetic, you know. They are curated, okay? That's the word I'm gonna use. They are curated moments of intimacy, okay? They are presented to us as non-curated, as something that, oh, this just happened, but how many photographs of your cat have you taken until your cat has achieved that pose, you know? Or how many, do you know what I mean? How many photographs of your baby have you taken until you got the perfect one? So I think they are still curated moments, even though we tend to present them as, no, this just happened, you know? But this is the same as it happened before. The difference is that before, your family album was something that you were showing to a selected few. And now you have the opportunity with social media to show your family album, if you like, to the whole entire world. And that presents a lot of opportunities, but I think it also presents a lot of challenges. In terms of gender practices, what I have read in relation to social media and the presence of family photographs is that actually women experience quite a bit of anxiety in having to curate all of that. So the emotions that they attach to having a constant presence of the mobile phone, for example, and having to take care of that in addition to everything else is something that while, you know, it will maybe foster the relationship with family members that are far away or whatever, it's also something that is straining them, you know. Mirka Media Now did a beautiful study on mothers who had left the Philippines, I think it was, for the UK, and how they use different technologies to keep in touch with their children, and how they kept being really strained and stressed by having to do that in addition to everything else. And Taipale and Fortunata and Taipale have a similar study in relation to the smartphone and the emotions of women. So it seems that the second shift, you know, the so-called second shift, is extending to the curation of the public presence of the family.
Yeah, and then, yes, it's important to mention the challenges, of course, but speaking of the opportunities, my colleague asked in the chat that do you think if photography can also work as a tool to establish new forms of families, such as homosexual families in society? So, of course, undermining the idea of the nuclear family, which you already mentioned.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's why the work, you know, for example, of Nan Goldin is so fundamental still today, you know, because she was one of the first art photographers to capture what LGBTI plus families look like, what the everyday of a homosexual couple look like, and how love, it doesn't matter, you know, how love has no borders, and how gay love looks like heterosexual love, how lesbian parenting is parenting nevertheless. So I think that art photography has a big role to play in there, and I think some of the artists that you have current on exhibition have done exactly that.
The show is still on view until the end of this week. So yeah, anyone who has the chance to come to Switzerland or to Winterthur, please feel free to see the exhibition. It's only 1 week left. But yeah, thank you again. I think the time is really up now. And Rebecca, also thank you for your inputs. It's really worth thinking and mentioning that, of course, the consumerism of images also through Instagram, of course, affects our view on family, death, as you mentioned, grief in your comment, it's a really good and worth mentioning comment, but of course it can also pose, of course, many opportunities in terms of communication. So as we do right here, we're like transnationally communicating with each other. It's still a common medium, and we're really glad and happy that we were able to have you here and that you made the time to join us tonight. And have a good trip tomorrow to Spain.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Delighted to be here. And thanks very much for the invitation. It has been a pleasure.